We're going to start into the next group of sessions now. So I present to you Frédéric.
Thank you. Okay, there's no need for you to hide at the back of the room. I am totally unharmful. I'm as meek and gentle as you can imagine. So please move forward and let us get started. So, je m'appelle Frédéric Julien. Je suis descendant de 11e génération de colons français. Je suis né à Loretteville, tout près de Wendake. I'd like to believe that my ancestors traded respectfully with the Huron-Wendat nation. Nothing could be more uncertain. As the white man presenting on the topic of Indigenous artists and open data, I invite you to ask your questions in unrestrained fashions. You can be hard on me, ask the tough questions, and I'll take them in. I'm the one presenting, but I'm not on my own. I'll be presenting my colleagues later on. There's a link and a QR code there. I'm not sure that you can scan it, but this presentation is made available on a Creative Commons attribution share alike license. So you're welcome to reuse that content whenever it suits you. So how did this project begin? This is my personal impetus for this project. It began as I was attending a talk on AI and being invited to take active citizenship about AI, take a role to make AI for good. And I asked myself, how can we let AI make sense of the world? Do supervised and unsupervised training with data that is either devoid of information about Indigenous people or worse, includes data that depicts them in pejorative terms. That was my call to action. That call to action was also reflected yesterday by Elder Gwen Phillips in her talk when she said, people are looking to us as problems because the only data that you collect is about our problems. So again, that speaks to the impetus behind this project. So how did this journey begin? This project is a project led by the Canadian Association for the Performing Arts, but in partnership with the Indigenous Performing Arts Alliance, with our folks at the tech company Culture Creates, and with a bunch of allies as part of this umbrella thing called the Linked Digital Future Initiative, which is funded, and I have to thank those funders because otherwise none of that would have happened. Starting with Canadian Heritage, the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, and also the Wikimedia Foundation. So the team, I'm not alone leading this work. My teammates could not come with me today, but I'd like to acknowledge them because I know that they're watching online. Britt Johnston, Andrew Singh, Bridget McIntosh, Caitlin Troughton, Gregory Sommier-Finch, and a bunch of other contributors as well. So what was the objective for this project? We wanted to make it easier for people who are interested in the creative output of Indigenous artists to actually find information about those works and performances online. At present, it's not easy. If you look for Indigenous performances, well, if you look for a performance period by any company, it's hard to find. Add the word Indigenous there, you're just making it harder for you to get to the information that you're trying to get to. Some of our guiding principles, nothing about us without us. So it was absolutely essential that we did this from the very beginning with Indigenous allies, and that we ultimately left control with them. And it also needed to be oriented towards driving benefits for these Indigenous artists, not just for us as the producers of open data. So that was actually not easy, because what we thought might be perceived benefits by Indigenous artists were not necessarily always perceived that way by those artists. So there was a lot of learning along the way. The notion of digital discoverability doesn't resonate with an Indigenous artist, because if it does resonate, the word discovery has other meanings for them. So briefly about our journey. So there was essentially two projects that happened, or series of projects that happen alongside one another. So there was a series of action and research activities that began as early as 2019. So we had a first discussion paper, then a first research report being published, and then we went into consultations. First, a large group consultation, and then we did, and that was likely the whole thing has been a wonderful journey, but that part of it was very fun. We actually did user testing acceptance with Indigenous artists using Wikidata as a platform. And we monitored their feedback as they were creating a Wikidata item about themselves. Then we did group consultations as well. And we're just about, I was hoping that it would be published in time for this event, but it's not. We'll be publishing a report that will include all the learnings that we've had so far in these endeavors. And then alongside with that, we wanted to take action. So we did rapid prototyping. Well, it was not rapid, because we first needed to sit down and talk and agree on what we needed to do, and that began as early as 2020, and then it took a while before we actually got the funding and got the project going. But one important milestone, landmark in this project was the moment when we actually agreed on the consent strategy and what would eventually become the IPA, IPA being the Indigenous Alliance for the Performing Arts, what would become the IPA Indigenous Data Sovereignty Strategy. And I'll be talking about that a bit more. And then eventually what we did once that consent was obtained from the artists is that we extracted their entire member directory using AI and natural language processing. We transformed that to linked open data, and we loaded that to the Arts Data Knowledge Graph and then to Wikidata. So the IPA data sovereignty strategy, as I said, is where the change could actually start in this project. There's a link there so that you can consult it. It's a very neat document. So this strategy really began by highlighting the benefits, the collective benefits and the individual benefits for the artists. And as I said, we had to actually figure out what would be perceived as benefits by these artists. And it also, oh, wrong point. It took a two-eyed approach. So looking both at FAIR principles, but also Indigenous principles, including the CARE principles and the principles of the First Nations Open Data Strategy. And it emphasized heavily ownership and control by Indigenous artists. That was our main selling point. We tried to convince those artists that by publishing information about them in the IPA member directory, that this was a means by which they could actually control what information would circulate about them over the web of text and the web of data. So the data modeling was co-defined with the Indigenous Performing Arts Alliance. The extract, transform, and load process done by our colleagues at Culture Create. And then, as I said, we loaded this to the Arts Data Knowledge Graph and to Wikidata. And as a result, 176 member profiles were uploaded, and that represented a 73% increase in the number of records about Indigenous artists in Wikidata. Is this an outcome? Yes, but it's not the end of this project. That was just one important milestone, but I'm really not seeing this as a final outcome. It's just a step in an ongoing process. Here's a sample item by Aqua Nibi Wawascone. It's one of 176. We won't go into Wikidata right now, and I cannot really take you there because I don't have access to my own computer. I'd like to go to do that and show you how it looks like and how easy it is to edit this item, but that will be for some other time. Now, the most important parts, what we learned along the way, and where are we in our journey today. So first, self-identification information is critical. So if you want users to eventually be able to retrieve information about works by Indigenous artists, about performance by Indigenous artists, you need to know who these Indigenous artists are. That is absolutely essential. Problem is, it's not really easy to get to the point where Indigenous artists do self-identify, consent to self-identify as open data, and to actually translate that into open data. So let's talk about that. So a lot of Indigenous artists were in Wikidata before we started, but were not identified as such, as Indigenous. And because of that, there was no way to query them as Indigenous artists. The property or field by which you can document a person's origin or ancestry in Wikidata is called ethnic group. As you can imagine, this label was received with mixed feelings by participants in our individual and group consultations. So they told us that field labels that would make more meaning for them would be ancestry, ancestral group, affiliation, tribal affiliation, traditional homeland, home community, and traditional territory would be better names for that field. And they told us, well, let's change it. Okay, that was a very interesting moment for me. Sure, I'd like to change it, but I'm, one of a community of 30,000 Wikidata user. If I change it on my own, someone might revert my change. But yeah, I hear you. We have to have a talk about that and look at ways of changing that label. Indigenous identities, they are absolutely multifaceted. So most Indigenous persons want to acknowledge all of their various ancestries. Usually they have more than one. Good news, this is entirely possible to do this in Wikidata. Wikidata is not about putting people in a box. You can add as many values as you want to any field. It's all about many-to-many relationships. So from this point of view, it's great. But then, when you look at the available self-identification information, oftentimes First Nations artists will self-identify based on their people, their traditional people, and their First Nations band. And one example is Kevin Loring, from who's the artistic director of the National Arts Center Indigenous Theater. He identifies as a Nlaka'pamux from the Leiden First Nation. So he has two identities, two pieces of identity that need to be represented individually in Wikidata. How can I do this as a settler? Do I have the right to go in Wikidata and make that information available for them? And how am I to decide which property to use to state this information? I'd have no right to do this. And then artists who self-identify as Métis sometimes mean that I am a descendant from the Red River Métis people, but sometimes they also intend to affirm that they have mixed ancestry, but they use the same label. So how can I interpret that information when I'm seeing it on a web page somewhere? So because you cannot presume anything, you have to ask Indigenous artists. There is no other way. Now, actually, there is another way, yeah, that's essentially what we did with IPA here. So with IPA, our colleagues at IPA recognized the value of having Indigenous information about Indigenous artists loaded to Wikidata. But they didn't have that granular self-identification information in a format that could be easily interpreted and transformed as accurate open data. What they only had were three broad categories: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And so they had to make a decision. Is that good enough to be loaded to Wikidata? And their decision was, well, we need to start somewhere, and that's what we have. And by uploading this information to Wikidata, we make a first step towards achieving findability, to be able to query Indigenous artists. So that's what they did in the first iteration of that upload. So artists are identified as being part of the ethnic group First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. Is that accurate? Is that the best kind of data that we could have about those artists? No, but we needed to start somewhere, and that was their decision. We also learned that colonial structures are a concern, obviously, for Indigenous artists. So even in Wikidata, even though it is multilingual by design, it is full of colonial labels borrowed from national libraries. And one example, for example, was the hoop dance. When we tried to describe that in an artist practice hoop dance, the item was called Native American hoop dance. Of course, that artist said, well, I'm not doing Native American hoop dance. I do hoop dance. And I say, yeah, I hear you. There's no reason for this item to be called Native American hoop dance. It is just hoop dance. And based on the label guidelines in Wikidata, it should be just hoop dance. So I said, okay, fine. I made that edit right away in Wikidata. Turns out someone reverted that edit to Native American hoop dance. I did not revert it back because there are rules in Wikidata that you should not do this. It's called edit warring. So I could not edit it back. So I'm waiting until the report comes out, and I'm flagging this story in the report to go back to the Wikidata community and have it changed for good. Yeah, enough about this slide. So, okay, if you go into Wikidata and you start entering information about a person, one of the recommended fields that will be prompted by Wikidata will be citizenship. Citizenship is not the best way to indicate an Indigenous artist's provenance. There are other properties like place of birth, work location, that are much more apt at representing accurately, granularly where these artists are from. And that information can then be represented not only according to the boundaries of state nations, but also according to the boundaries of their traditional territories. As I said, we're still in the process of achieving this digital transformation for Indigenous artists and with Indigenous artists. So where are we next? So we have this report called Indigenous Artists and Wikidata Explorations and Consultation Report that will be released sometimes very soon. And I'll make sure with Paul that this report is shared with the Open Data Society when it does come out. We are also in the process of supporting Indigenous artists to actually have full agency, not only over their member record with the Indigenous Performing Arts Alliance, but also directly in Wikidata. So we uploaded some information about them, but there's a whole lot more that they could decide to add if they want to. We would very much like to see artists using Wikidata to also describe their works the productions that they contributed to. And there are ways for this to happen, provided that they actually want to make that step. And I would personally very much like Indigenous artists to make their best photos available for free use with Wikimedia Commons. But again, it has to be part of a dialogue and it has to be their decision. And we also need to do further research to start accurately describing artistic and cultural practices of Indigenous artists. There is some information about that in Wikidata. It's sometimes inaccurately depicted, incomplete. Similar work could be done in Wikipedia as well. And that is work that that we are considering to continue in the next year, depending on our colleagues' availability to take on more of this work with us. And then, as I said, we need to engage with the Wikidata community to actually implement the recommendations of the report. And that's where I'm gonna take a stand for my Indigenous colleagues. We are holding a Wikidata workshop for Indigenous artists this Thursday. That's why I'll be heading back tomorrow morning, because I need to be back home to lead these sessions on Thursday. And we will be also doing for you guys, if you want to learn more about Wikidata, Kepakoa and the Open Data Society are co-hosting a hands-on introductory workshop about Wikidata on December 1st. So that's your opportunity to find out what this platform is like, what it can do in terms of creating open data about anything in the world. And that's just reference information about the Link Digital Future Initiative, along with the link to the website where you can find a whole lot more about our works and the reports that we published. And now that's where you ask the tough questions about the work that we did. So please throw them at me. And if there are any people watching online, please do ask your questions online as well, please.
Hello, yeah, thanks so much for the talk. I just wanted to, go back to, I mean, we had a speaker talking about how in the future for AI and open data, we want all of this data to be as properly labeled as possible. And so I just wanted to mention that I think it's really good that you're working on that initiative to kind of elaborate and specify the Indigenous identities of these different artists as they're kind of making their data available. And I just think it's important, that it's as specific as possible, and that, we have self-identification, but then if there's a possibility to have like community acceptance too, like, for example, for the Red River Métis example, where you have some people identifying as Métis because they're historic Red River Métis Nation, or people who are identifying as Métis because they have mixed ancestry and maybe they're not actually directly related to that nation, So just kind of bringing up the importance of community acceptance and citizenship and things like that, just to make sure that if something's labeled as Métis, that it's actually Métis, and that if something's mixed heritage, then it's mixed heritage, So I just kind of wanted to bring that up and just say that I think it's great that you're kind of elaborating on that and helping that kind of bloom. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you raise a good point about community acceptance. As a settler, it is beyond my my role to actually even talk about how people should self-identify or not, and what is the proper way to do it, and what Métis should mean or not. So the one thing that I'm not doing, for example, I'm not editing items about nations or Indigenous people. it is not my, it is beyond what I should ethically be doing. It needs to be done, but it has to be done by Indigenous people themselves once they collectively agree on how they should be represented in Wikidata as a nation, as a people. So the realm of my action is quite limited there as a Wikimedian. So I will need eventually to keep working with my Indigenous allies who are also Wikimedians, so that together with their peers, we achieve greater accuracy with how nations are represented in Wikidata. Because nations and bands and languages can be represented in Wikidata, and sometimes these concepts are confused. There is a bit of conflation. You can end up looking at an item that appears to describe a First Nation band, but it's categorized as a reserve, but it's got the same name, and then people are using it as if it were a band, and actually the item described a reserve. It may have the same name, but ultimately these are two different concepts. And when you're producing open data, the name matters, the label matters, but the concept matters equally, if not more.
Hello. So we've got some activity online here. First, Britt Johnston said, yes, that's a fair point. It's also difficult to include community acceptance when it may exclude many people who have been disenfranchised or removed from their community because of, for example, the 60 scoop or other racist policies. Then we have a question here from Carol McKay-Matak. Great talk. I learned a lot. Did you find that you had to work on some of your own biases while you were working on this project?
Absolutely. Am I done working on my personal biases? Absolutely not. You know, the report that I announced will be released soon. That report has got an ISBN number to it and a commitment to legal deposit. And, you know, I realized yesterday as I was listening to a session that we never really formally agreed among our partners that would be depositing this report with Library and Archives Canada. So there goes a bias, you know. That's my Western way of doing things. And I never really asked my colleagues if that was the way that they wanted the report to be published. So that's one example. You know, about biases, I talked about earlier about the benefits for Indigenous artists. And I began the project presuming that artists wanted to be digitally discoverable, that they wanted to be in the web of data. But we did not hear this very clearly from all artists. Actually, a lot of them said, you know, not sure we want to be in Wikidata, you know? Why don't we build our own database? And I said, sure, please do this. But yet I kept insisting that, meanwhile, can we look at Wikidata as an option? Because if we wait until you build your own database to have open data about you, there will be further years during which AI will be learning about the world and will have an incomplete or negative vision of Indigenous artists. So those were my biases, definitely.
Thank you. Another follow-up question, and actually one, I also have this question. It seems there's a couple people who are quite curious about this. So this is from Katrina Ingram. I found your comment about not wanting to start a wiki war very interesting. It makes me think about whose voice or perspective is centered. Wondering if you want to comment more on that. And I'd ask sort of a follow-up question, because my understanding as well is that there's usually like a whole backside like conversation around any wiki data on Wikipedia or different sources. So it's like, really curious about what was the discussion around the change back?
First of all, Wikidata, even though I'm depicting it in this particular case as a tough community to be in, it's not. It's generally, I have to say, a very supportive, welcoming community. It's one that I'm happy to be a part of. but it's a community made of individuals, and each of these individuals come in with their own biases. And a lot of the information that, okay, let's go back to the label guidelines in Wikidata. In Wikidata, the label guidelines say that we should name an item by the name it is most commonly known under. Well, it turns out in our Western world, we have shut down the names of used by indigenous people about their nations and their practices. We have given them different names, and that was suddenly the name that everyone needed to call them. Those are the names that were written down into our national libraries as subject headings. And so therefore, those are the names that we find in Wikidata. And it can change within those guidelines, and you have to be in constant dialogue with the community to get to the point where it does change. One nice thing about Wikidata is that even though an item or a property has a specific label as a main label, you can give it as many aliases, also known as you want. You can also describe as a data point the name of an item in its native language. This being said, we should strive to change those colonial labels into the labels that indigenous artists and indigenous nations would want to see in Wikidata. And that's something that I'm attempting to do slowly. But in this particular case, when you go into edit warring, there's a rule that tells me if I make a change and someone reverts it back, I am not allowed. Now, that the person who reverted back, one could argue, started the edit warring, but my role as a responsible member of this community is not to change it once again. So I need to go into a dialogue with the community using the project chat saying, hey folks, this happened. I need to notify the members of the Wiki project, Indigenous peoples in Canada, about this change and get them involved and reach a consensus that from now on, Native American hoop dance, even if that's the label of that article in Wikipedia, that in Wikidata, it should just be hoop dance.
So I guess the follow-up question then is like that conversation has already started then on within the community.
Well, I put this particular conversation on pause until the report came out, because once the report comes out, I can actually turn to it as a reference to justify that the item should be called just hoop dance.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name's Erin Korst, and I'm the executive lead on the First Nations Data Governance Strategy. So I'm so happy to see the reference to the strategy in your talk. I'm really curious about barriers to what you're doing and policy changes that are needed around First Nations, reclaiming their language, through their language, reclaiming their identities for their communities, for their children, right? And I know there's a lot of barriers for, new parents wanting to name their children an Indigenous name. And I'm just wondering whether the work that you're doing today will possibly bring about some of the policy changes where they're really needed, at the provincial level, say, for example, who restrict us from, being able to use the proper names in our own languages. I just wonder whether there's any thinking around the policy piece.
These projects were never really intended to be part of a policy conversation on Indigenous names outside of Wikidata and the Ars Data Knowledge Graph, which are the two databases that we're using to propagate information. If, however, over time, because we do contribute to raising the profile of Indigenous artists, that this has positive benefits upon Indigenous persons, that they feel greater pride about their culture and about their artists, and that this contributes to a reappropriation of Indigenous names and languages, then I would be the happiest person in the world.
Well, good luck, because that's where it needs to go.
There's plenty of time left. I think yeah, so are there more questions? Do you want to have a glance at a Wikidata item, see what it looks like?
I think technically in terms of time, we've got 2 minutes before we go into a 15-minute break.
Okay, so we're good,
We're
actually.
basically at time. Yeah, so thank you so much. There's another point here online from Caitlin Owen. Interesting to consider also our Western wiki practice of cite your sources. Who do we typically accept as experts? Where are these sources we typically look to confirm from? Lots of Western biases needed to be unpacked.
Okay, interesting question. There is a certain deletionist movement, a strong deletionist movement in Wikipedia, in English Wikipedia in particular, and very stringent expectations from members of this movement about references being serious references. We have a similar, although smaller, deletionist movement in Wikidata, and in the requests for deletion pages, we often see requests for deletions of items of artists because they're not notable enough. This is another fight that I need to take for those artists and really challenge how the notability guidelines in Wikipedia are interpreted. As I will be delivering a workshop for Indigenous artists on Thursday, I will actually be talking to them about that, about ways that they can ensure that the items that they are creating about themselves and their peers do not get deleted. I'll be teaching them how to monitor their item and to make sure that they are notified if someone says, oh, this person is not notable enough and should be removed from Wikidata. And I'll tell them, if that happens, you email me, and if I don't respond, within 24 hours, you call me, and I'm gonna get on that thread, and I'm gonna fight until that item sticks. It's happening all the time. It's happening all the time. People, well-intended Wikimedians bring in their biases and suddenly decide that something is not notorious enough. Now, if you're an Indigenous artist, how likely is it that there will be an article in the Globe and Mail about you? I mean, if you're an artist, period, how likely it is that you'll be in the Globe and Mail or any newspaper. But if you're an Indigenous artist, that's even harder. And so for an Indigenous artist to have, just an article in the Yukon News, well, that is, in my mind, a very serious source, and I would defend that as being a credible source. So yeah, lots of biases and lots of mindsets that we need to change progressively. And I have a fighting instinct, but when I engage with these folks that do have different views than mine, I have to be careful not to lead to a defensive reaction on the other end, which will make them dig their heels, because then change won't happen. So you need to actually try to respond with love and kindness and generosity. And I'm capable of doing that too. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, everyone. Please, if you have further questions, do not hesitate to reach out. I'll be happy to keep chatting with you.